And welcome to the NWCA's MatStats show. I am Jason Bryant, joined with Glenn Gormley and Kevin Hazard, and this is a show diving into the statistics behind the sport of wrestling in a little bit of a different manner. Today, we'll be talking about some stats in terms of growth of the sport, and joining us are our resident statistician, stat nerd, and William and Mary alums. These guys know a little bit about the great city of Williamsburg. Glenn Gormley and Kevin Hazard. We'll start with you, Glenn. You're a stats junkie. You're a stats nerd just like me. What possesses you to dive into wrestling stats like this?
Okay, well, the first thing is, Jason, I have a master's degree in stats from William and Mary, so I've always been interested in that. Did my graduate thesis on stats in baseball, and then the executive director of the NWCA, Mike Moyer, asked me to write a book on stats and wrestling, so that's how I got involved in it.
Kevin Hazard, people know the last name for a couple different reasons. One, there's a tilt that bears the name, also known as the Fairfax Roll, Mason Tilt, and your son Brian's my co-announcer at the World Championships and the NCAA tournament. But you've got quite an accomplished scholastic wrestling coaching career and a collegiate wrestling career as well. That I believe started at what was then known Keystone Junior College.
Keystone Junior College. I was an All-American there, and then was captain of the William Mary wrestling team and two-time conference finalist there. But I'm no longer Kevin Hazard. I'm now Brian Hazard's dad. It happens to all of us. But since then, I've stayed active in wrestling in one way or another. I had a TV show, and then I coached kids for 30 years. So that's my background in wrestling. And Glenn and I have been friends for 30 years. We go to the NCAAs every year. We have for the last 25 years. And Glenn and I got together on this. Glenn asked me if I would help him with this, and I was just ecstatic to help, because I think it's a little different view of how we do wrestling, and I think it's important.
And to set the stage up a little bit, I've been tracking the dropped programs and working on what I've called the drop project since I was first hired at the NWCA in 2005. And this has been, 2005, let's do the math. So for 16 years, I've been working on the tracking down of programs we used to have, when they started, when they dropped. And it's an evolving process. Today, we're going to talk about there's been 304 programs added, men's and women's, since the year 2000. We're going to focus on some of those and some of the stats behind them divisionally. But this is something that I feel is important because we have been beating the drum that wrestling, we need to save wrestling. We need to save wrestling. Well, we're growing in wrestling, and those numbers, they did hit a low point. We'll talk about that. But we need to have accurate statistics to tell people what we've lost and how we've lost. Because in so many times we've heard, we had over 600 D1 programs at one point. Well, for example, that is false. There's never been that many Division I schools. There's only 351, and it's never been that many. We had over 1,000 schools at one point. Not at the same time. We need to find the clarity behind those stats so then we can present our arguments better, not just to administrations, but university presidents and to the public about what we've gone through. So this is speaking my language, and I'm glad to be here with Glenn and Kevin talking about the things about this and hammering down the stats. And some of that is going through old amateur wrestling newses, USA Wrestler, using newspapers.com to dig up articles on when did Vanderbilt have a wrestling team? Does that count as a drop? How do we apply things to, is it university budgets? Is it football and basketball we're blaming? Is it Title IX? What are the culprits behind the lawsuits? Is it schools closing? We've had a couple of those in COVID. So those are all the topics that we're going to pursue through this show and throughout the MatStats. Of course, we're also going to get to the tactical and technical discussions behind it, which goes over my head. I like this stuff. You guys were on the mat more so you guys can also handle the technical stuff. But we're going to start item number one, and Glenn has a great PowerPoint, which we are going to bring up on the screen throughout here. And we're going to start Iowa adding women's wrestling. As you say, it's a whole new ball game. And Iowa becomes the first Power 5 school to add a wrestling program. They joined Presbyterian and Sacred Heart as the only 3 Division I institutions. We go back and look at, seminal points in the sport of wrestling. We added, Little Rock a couple years ago. Presbyterian came on and added men's and women's wrestling simultaneously as a small Division I, enrollment driven. And there are things we look at, and then Iowa announcing its edition of women's wrestling. We joke that, sometimes the non-Power 5 schools don't move the needle. You want to talk about wrestling moving the needle? It's the sport of Iowa. It's the state of Iowa and the school, University of Iowa. Glenn.
Yes. First of all, Jason, thank you for doing all this for us. And so everyone knows, when I wrote my book, Jason was one of my biggest contributors on this. And we sat on the phone for hours one night, figured out how many teams there were in 1982, NAIA and NCAA combined. So on the specific topic about Iowa adding women's wrestling, okay, I've been in the sport since the early 70s. This is the biggest addition to the sport that we could possibly see. I give this a comparison to what happened in women's basketball. Anybody who's me and Hazard's age might remember this. There was a day when women's basketball was Immaculata College versus Westchester State for the title. It was a small regional sport. Then the Lady Vols came about with Pat Summitt, and now we all know how big it is. Okay, we see it every spring on their own March Madness. Okay, now that Iowa is at it, this opens up a whole new gate for everyone. Big Ten, other Power 5 schools. It's now becoming more of a household word. One of the problems we have is when people think of college sports, they think of Bama, Notre Dame, Clemson, Ohio State, the football powers. Well, three of them don't have wrestling. Okay, so they don't believe what's out there, and we're growing in many ways, like Jason said, outside the Power 5.
Well, I think something really interesting. And you brought up Pat Summitt, and at the time it was Immaculata, et cetera. Right now we have McKendree, Campbellsville, and I think there's a couple of things that I think Iowa's going to make a big difference in. One of my favorite authors is Malcolm Gladwell, and he wrote a book called The Tipping Point. And I think we might be at that point in women's wrestling, which is going to be good for wrestling. Right after Iowa added, it was like every other day or every third day, another school came along. So we've gone, and we're going to show you a graph a little, just how it started small and it's gone. We're not at exponential growth yet, but I think we're going to get there. I think we're going to look at like 2002 on and just the graph. I think 2021, 22, it's going to go exponential for the growth of sports, of wrestling.
Yeah, as we look at the graphic here, as of the 6th, we've had a team added here since. I mean, we've got teams adding left and right. Remember when Iowa was number 100? Now we're up to 109. And if we look at the 109 women's college programs that have that are currently wrestling or are announced to be starting, Iowa starts in 2023-24. All 109 teams started after 2000. We had our first junior national championships in Fargo in 2002. The world championships, though, from what was then known as FILA, started in 1989. So they had like an 11-year head start internationally. And then the first women's program we know was Minnesota Morris, which dropped both men's and women's wrestling in the early 2000s. Then we get the schools that have added, the Missouri Valley, the Pacific, University of the Cumberlands, the core four for a while. And then you had some, they were basically, their college nationals were kind of loosely club-based. A lot of, you had wrestlers that were representing like the Culinary Institute and things of that nature. Now we have the WCWA had come in, create a little bit of structure for an event, and we had our first WCWA Nationals, I want to say in 2004-ish, that rings a bell. And then we look at the number of teams that have come on. 109. I mean, everything's been the last 20 years. And you combine that with the number of high school teams or high school states that are sanctioning. The worry, Glenn, was about, are we adding college teams too fast because there weren't enough states that were supplying the college-ready women's wrestlers? Well, we're in the 30s now, and that's going to be approaching the 40s, so that concern is going to go away, I think, in 8 years total. I think 8 years away is when we're really going to see the fruits of this, when we have 2 full graduating classes coming through 9th through 12th grade to populate our schools. And who knows how many schools we're going to have by then, but they're on screen. We see the biggest growth coming in Division III and the NAI. The NAI really deserves a lot of credit for getting the ball rolling with the addition of women's wrestling. And Glenn, what have you seen from these smaller divisions, or I don't want to say smaller, but the non-Division I schools that have been more willing to add the sport?
Well, it's been great. It has been a smaller private thing, basically. There are some state schools that have done it in Colorado and Pennsylvania. There have been some state schools. But it's really great to see the growth of this and to give the women an opportunity. The same opportunity the three of us and thousands of other college men have had. They deserve the opportunity. And what's a wild thing is, especially me and Kevin's boomer generation, so many people don't realize how many women's teams there are. For example, as we speak, there's 79 Division One men's teams that we go and see every year and listen to uh, Jason and Brian Hazard announce. There's now 109 women's wrestling teams. There are more women's wrestling teams than there are men's Division One teams. It's a great thought to see it grow like that.
One thing to also consider is I didn't come from wrestling initially. I discovered wrestling when I was 15 years old, and I was a sports fan. And I use I don't want to call it an analogy, but a comparison. So when you go to like the NCAA Division III tournament, you see number one seeds get beat all the time. It is that UMBC Virginia 16-1 thing that sports fans love. It's headlines everywhere when it happens in March Madness when a 15 beats a 2. And these sports fans, they've heard of UMBC or maybe Valparaiso, or they're clued in on that Appalachian State, Norfolk State play-in game or something like that because they love the sport. They've heard of these schools. With only 79 Division I wrestling programs, there is no real excuse for some of us in the wrestling community to not think beyond 79. We can count to higher than that. There's no reason we shouldn't know our Nebraska Carnies in Division II, our St. Cloud States, beyond our Augsburg and Wartburg in Division III, our North Centrals, and into the NAIA with Life and Grandview, and schools that are starting up, like Central Methodist now has a woman as its men's head wrestling coach in an interim role. That just happened this week. So I feel like my plea to wrestling fans is do a little additional homework and don't just be clued in on only 79 teams. And be honest with you, you probably only care about 40. You have room to learn. These noggins, they can contain wrestling information. We just need to be able to find one or two. Everybody picked one or two teams outside of Division I and a women's team to follow. Our fan base would be more engaged, and we tell people about it. So that's my plea, to pay attention to the McHenrys of the world, to the Campbellsvilles, to the Kings, to the Lifes. Those are programs that have both men's and women's teams. And as Jason Mormon famously says at King University, he doesn't have two programs. He has one program with two teams. So there's the plea to the wrestling community to you can pick more than just Division I to follow.
Sure, I always said in my book, one family, one team, one sport. That's what we need to be. We need to be one family, one team, one sport. And to go into your point, Jason, about there's so much more out there, just like there's so much more out there in football than Bama and Notre Dame, et cetera. There are now 118, if you see the next slide that Jason just put up there, 118 Division III teams and 67 Division II teams. There's only 79 of the 264 teams are Division I. And then if you add all the teams, there's 423, counting NA and IA. Division I just a small part of it.
Well, and what's also interesting.
I think
go
about,
ahead, Kevin.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I think about Virginia. I mean, we've got the apprentice school, we have Ferrum, we've got a number of D3 schools, and the NCAA schools, which I think are doing a phenomenal job helping to build the sport. So to take your point, that is going on, and they're not even NCAA. So there's even more programs out there beyond that are basically club teams, but it's keeping, the sport. Gorms has an interesting statistic in his in the book that's not in today's thing, but I think it's like, isn't it like 2.9% of the high school kids have a place to get on a D1 team? Is that?
Yeah, we have that chart later on. What Jason mentioned, are there enough? We do have that chart on here, Kevin, for later.
That's even beyond the NCAA and the NAIA. I think we need to add, for the men's part, what's going on with the club teams. I think that's important for our growth too.
We've had several teams that have announced. I know one of the most famous ones was Newberry in Division II. They added a team. They started as a club, competed as a club for a year, then elevated themselves to Division II. Southern Virginia, which that's in Buena Vista, just outside of Lexington. They had an NCAA club team for a long time, elevated it to Division III. Shriner down in Texas, men's and women's teams, they were competing in the NCAA, elevated their schools to their sports to varsity status. So that's something to pay attention to. I also want to talk about the growth real quick, because I also track participation stats across all the divisions. And we look at the NAIA at 80 coming up here. And did you know how many schools the NAIA had competing in 2000, 2001 at their national championships? How many NAIA schools were there 20 years ago.
It was a lot less, Jason. I remember this in the
It
book.
was 18.
Yep.
18. They were down to 18. And what did they do? They added the opportunity to have 12 wrestlers compete, so you could have more than one wrestler to weight. And then they start looking as enrollment driven. What can we do? And then all of a sudden, you start seeing women's programs and the NAI being accepting to that. I mean, the NAI, has flag football for women, so they're more willing to be able to try. I guess because they're probably their governance structure does allow for a little bit more creativity in a shorter time frame. But then we look at the number of schools. 72 schools that have added wrestling since 2000 have men's and women's components to them. So we've had 72 schools add both sports, add both teams in the last 20 years. So those are some key things to look at. The growth. I mean, Division II, if we pull up my numbers here, which are not on screen for you, Division II had gotten to 38 teams in 2003. Yes. And they're on the fringe of 70, and we're seeing some of those schools that are reclassifying from the NAIA to Division II. We've seen Notre Dame College, we've seen McHenry, we've seen Lindenwood, Simon Fraser, which had a monster NAIA program in the 80s and 90s. They're not just a women's force. I mean, they're the only Canadian school in the NCAA, but we're seeing those type of schools reclassify to also bolster the Division II numbers as well. And then the NAIA is basically backfilling those teams with new programs like Pikeville, or U-Pike as they call it, out in the mountains of Kentucky is another ad. I think that might be one of the closest colleges to Grundy, an hour away from Grundy out there in the corner.
It's up the road. Yeah, it's interesting, Jason, because I went into this in my book where the NAIA is almost like it's their model is more sound business model than the NCAA. It's done more frugally and stuff, giving kids more opportunities. And a lot of those schools did grow into NCAA schools, which is fine. But you're right. We're backfilling it through the NAIA. And, just like we've said several times here, we need to remember the U-Pikes that come in. That helps. The junior colleges that come in. Everything that comes in is great.
And Kevin, to that point, granted the times were different. You started your career to junior college. I mean, it was, you didn't just say, and granted the divisional structures were different in what wrestling was in your era. I'm not going to get into the actual dates and tell everybody exactly how ancient you are, but you had an opportunity to get on the mat that opened doors to a larger institution, to get an advanced degree and things of that nature. So the opportunities do exist. You're living proof.
When Kevin started wrestling, William and Mary wasn't a college yet.
Yeah. I mean, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and then Kevin.
Yes.
I don't know. You came over, man. You were over there with Captain John Smith, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
Well, Kevin was an extra in Pocahontas, by the way.
He was an extra, yes.
Anyway, so these non-Division I schools are where the growth is coming, and as Mike Moyer points out, there is another pathway to becoming and adding Division I institutions. We've seen LIU with a very interesting way of combining their Brooklyn campus and their Post campus into one athletic department. Boom, there's a Division II institution at LIU Post. Well, that wrestling program ceases to exist, but it does create LIU, now the Sharks, in the main Division I campus. Now they're ready to go. We've also had schools move into Division I. Bellarmine started a program by basically absorbing what happened when St. Catherine's closed and said, all right, they were Division II at the time, and then they've reclassified to Division I. And California Baptist has gone from the NAI to Division II to Division I since starting their program. That's something that's really interesting too. So those last two programs still looking to be championship eligible soon. I believe Cal Baptist eligible next year. Bellarmine's still got a little bit of time, but that's another pathway to Division I. And it seems like some of our fans too, though, if it's not adding in Division I, it doesn't matter. Well, guess what? Morgan State just added, brought their program back, restored its program after having such a great Division II legacy. And of course, most people talking about Morgan State in the Division I ad have been talking about Jim Phillips and his savvy dressing back in the day. Kevin, you have any experience, because you're up in that Northern Virginia, Baltimore, the DMV area? You have any memories of Jim Phillips in the corner?
I do remember him as a coach, pretty flamboyant. But what I really remember about Morgan State is how tough they were. They had a really, really tough program, and you weren't going to walk on the mat with them. I don't care what division you were in, and come away with an easy victory. You had to earn every point wrestling against Morgan State.
Jason, to answer your question, when I wrestled and coached at William Mary, I remember Coach Phillips well. It was great competing against him. That guy was always intense and just very flamboyant. He was a great man. He did a lot for the sport. I'm happy Morgan State's bringing it back.
Yeah, it'd be great. Well, we're going to have more HBCUs adding wrestling too. I know that the
Yeah.
HBU wrestling community and Mike Novogratz was a big part of the
Novo
money
is a great
behind
part of this. Yep.
I was
Morgan
going to
State
say
ad.
thanks to Mike Novogratz for
Yep.
that was a very
No
important.
question.
Now, getting back to the discussion about Iowa, looking at I guess the trickle down. So we discussed this a bit already, but Iowa was 100. We were Southwestern, unfortunately, looked to add a women's team, never really got off the ground. They hired a coach, had a couple athletes, and then nothing really happened there. So they never competed in a match, and we basically had to remove them from our count, which oddly enough worked out in Iowa's favor to be number 100. Now we're at 109, and as you're saying, we're adding a team once a week, less than once a week, once every 5 business days. It's crazy.
Yeah. It's just, you need a ticker tape like the old stock market thing to follow all the men and women's teams that are adding. I mean, hats off to
NWCA Online. We've got it on the website. You can click on the new teams. We
hats
got
off to the NWCA, to Mike Moyer, Jason Bryant. Get
our app. Bring our phone. Let's see what's the latest ad. Let's app developer. It's like watching E-Trade.
Yes.
Or how is Bitcoin doing today? Well, how is women's wrestling and men's wrestling adding today? All-time high. We're approaching. We're gonna try to approach all-time highs. We got to get it back to the numbers we had, but it's a slow build. And what's also interesting too is more than half of our programs, our current teams that we have in college wrestling, have been added in the last 20 years. That's pretty crazy.
No, it's crazy, and you can see on the next slide here how it looks like it's really getting to be a geometrical curve there from 2012 to current. This is the amount of women's 4-year college teams, and it's just really amazing how it's just growing so quickly.
And I think that's going to go really. I mean, that's kind of arithmetic. It's going to go exponential. I really think we've hit a tipping point.
What's a great thing about this, and what I've seen when I wrote my book on all this, is once we had the advent of women's wrestling, men's wrestling started coming back. Okay, since 2012 is when women's wrestling really started getting big. NCAA has added 45 men's teams, and since 2019, 20. So, I mean, I know we've been sidetracked with a lot of other things that have gone on in the world the last almost 2 years now, but there's been great news in wrestling. I mean, there really has been. It's wild how many teams have added.
And we really didn't. I mean, we did get pinched during COVID, my alma mater included, but we look at the amount of teams lost in other sports, and I was tracking this. I think it was in the hundreds of teams that we lost, hundreds of athletes losing opportunities across all sports. Wrestling, really, for the most part, spared a lot of the pain there. Obviously Fresno and Old Dominion gone. Stanford we saved. We had closures at Urbana and McMurray. It was just, we lost Spartanburg Methodist, a junior college, basically because they didn't have anybody really near them, at least at the point they dropped, to compete. So we did really kind of duck and cover on the COVID thing, and it didn't hit us like tennis. I think lost 70 something teams, which is just it's crazy. But
it's nice to see something good happen in these crazy last 20 months or whatever it's been, and that's been one of them. And as you can see on the screen here now, okay, we currently have 265 men's NCAA teams. That is more than we've had since 1992. Okay, if you ask the average wrestling fan this question, they will be stunned at this because they really believe that there was, as Jason said in the beginning, 1,000 teams or whatever in the beginning. There weren't.
And again, sometimes the issue here is that it's Division I or nothing. It's like that's the pulse of wrestling. Well, the pulse of wrestling is, again, to kind of echo what Mike Moyer likes to talk about. And this is one of the speaking points that isn't just a speaking point. This is something I actually believe in, because where are your high school coaches coming from? They're not Brent Metcalf. They're not coming from the Power Five. They're not the D1 world teamers. Your high school wrestling coaches are a lot of places, especially in the Midwest. You looking around the state of Iowa, how many of those Iowa high school wrestling coaches were Division III athletes at Buena Vista or Wartburg or Simpson or Coe or Loris? I mean, you've got the small colleges are where the growth of the sport and the advocacy for the sport in the high school hallways comes from. And as Mike says, the next generation of teachers and coaches come from everything, from the bottom half of numbers of teams in Division I all the way through to the NAI and the junior colleges. So any program, especially now we dialed it down on the NCAA side of things, we look in because and you use 92 for an example. 1992, there were 108 Division I schools. Okay, so we're down almost 30. We've made a climb back up. Our low point was in 2019 with 75. We're now 79, moving towards 80. But it's too many people look at just that column as an indicative point of where the health of the sport is, whereas you need to look at the NCAA column. You need to look at the NAIA column, the total column, because we have at the highest point at the end of 2020, to borrow my own stats here, 372 schools that had this is just men's wrestling programs. We hadn't been that high. I mean, we hadn't been over 300. The first time we went over 300 was in 92. Let's look at 92. And then we were losing 10 and we lost 29 schools one year. I mean, it's one of those things that we're on the way back up. We're building. We still need to get, I haven't seen a 400 here in a while. So on the men's side. So when we hit that number, you're going to start looking at when the NCAA started keeping stats in 81, 82. That's really kind of where we have to start, because otherwise you have to do it by hand, which I am doing. But it's just looking at that NCAA number, Glenn, as you point out, super important to get across.
Yeah, and it's really the whole sport of wrestling has rebounded. And the rebound really started when women's wrestling came to be popular. It really is. And if you look at this screen now that Jason has up, it's the number of NCAA men and women's teams. Okay, we now have 318. Okay, that's just NCAA. Okay, it's the most we've had since 1985. Now, granted, somebody can say, well, Gorm's, part of these are women's teams. Yeah, but there's opportunities out there for a human being to wrestle. Everyone deserves this opportunity. Men and women both deserve it.
I think the key thing is that the bleeding has stopped. I mean, I think we were almost in triage, and like Gorms just said, the women became a significant part of the sport. The bleeding stopped, and now we're growing again. And I think all of us feel the future is unlimited. We're going up from here.
Yeah, and if you look at the next slide there, Jason, it shows you this is the number of NCAA and NAIA men and women's 4-year programs combined. When I released my book last October of 2020, Jason and I had a long conversation to figure out how many men and women's teams there were in 1982. Okay, we had to do it all by hand. Okay, thank you for all that help, Jason.
A lot of pouring through old amateur wrestling news is what I actually have in this office here, and we also had to be careful too, because we couldn't just count. You can't just look at the number of teams in NAIA.
No, because NCAA has dual membership, etc.
Well, we had a lot of those dual members that wrestled in both. Parkside, there were schools that were doing that, so we had to be careful about that.
Schools.
Davidson was even competing in the NAIA tournament that year.
Yep. So what happened when I was on my way up to Moyer in the NWCA? We had 417 at the time, okay, in October, whatever the early date was. When I was driving up there, I got a text from Moyer that Friends University in Kansas added a men and women's team, okay, a school that not many people have heard of, but they added 2 teams that brought us up to 419. That was more than we had ever since 1982. However, look at it now, 13 months later, now there's 443. That's the kind of growth we're having here. My book is antiquated. It's a year old.
Yeah, it's one of those things. It's like when you put it out in print, it becomes obsolete almost immediately. It loses 90% of its value as soon as you drive it off the lot, right?
Exactly. That's exactly what happened.
So we've got a big old chart here. Now, this is something that I've also been tracking. Is the point of what sports are growing. And some people will argue that, interests are different and people are playing different sports. Now, we go back to the 70s when we look at the National Federation of High School, the stats, the NFHS stats that have this big giant peak in the 70s. Well, there were fewer sports offered in high schools back then. Now we have the kids have the opportunity to play a lot of different sports, and there were fewer options in college. And of course, on the women's side, there were nothing really to speak of. Women's sports was really in its infancy in the 70s and into the early 80s. And again, pointing out Pat Summitt, who I had a great respect for, knowing where I went to school and then having to make that trip to Knoxville and hearing Rocky top 3,000 freaking times during a game in a sold-out Thompson Bowling Arena For
I
women's
got
basketball, it's
Smokey
nuts.
behind me. You can never hear Rocky Top enough.
Yeah, you can hear Rocky Top enough. Trust me, I know it. But we look at the growth points and where the sport's growing and percentages. In some cases, okay, yeah, like lacrosse is like the buzzword, huge in the Northeast. Well, that hasn't seen like crazy growth. Yeah, they're up in number of teams, but also we've had the number of NCAA schools has expanded. It's gone from 270 to 350 plus. So while we might have more teams, those may have been existing teams coming in from the NAIA. It's just there's more opportunity. So you got to look at to me, you got to look at the percentage of sponsorship, and a lot of those have also dropped,
Sure.
even though the number of teams have gone up.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing, Jason. I agree with you that the NCAA is growing with its amount of membership in a very nice way to give more kids opportunities. One of the things I've heard since, that we're all part of this when Title IX has been in existence is that Title IX is what destroyed men's wrestling. And by that point, it would have destroyed all men's sports. Now, if you look at this graph on the screen, these are the top 12 men's sports in NCAA participation. Okay. Only wrestling has seen a decrease in the amount of teams since women joined the NCAA in 81, 82. If it was actually Title IX, all these other sports would have seen a decrease in men's sports teams.
With probably the exception of men's basketball and football, which most people look at as, if they have football, you're not really going to cut it. And I mean, there's been a few instances where
exactly.
D1 teams, but men's basketball, 351 for 351. Every D1 school has men's basketball.
Football is the other sport besides us that was traditionally men only. Now, of course, we're different. One thing that football did interesting, which is another topic in another show, is when football switched, they split Division I from 1A and 1AA. Okay, which William Mary went 1AA with a bunch of the Aggies. That's a whole other show, but that was one thing football did to avoid being eliminated. Okay, so wrestling is the one sport that decreased the number of teams, men's teams, from 82 to 2019. But if you see on this chart, it says down 33%. On the far right column, from 2010 to 2019, we increased 13%. There's only a couple other sports that have increased that much in men's teams, which certainly seems that the advent of women's wrestling is what's really, really helped men's wrestling.
I looked at the same thing and I'm thinking Title IX still could be a factor in this because at the time they were trying to even up, even up the numbers. It became a thing if the campus was 55% women, 55% of the athletes. That was the leg they were using to do Title IX. There wasn't a women's sport a women's wrestling to kind of balance the numbers, and so they're looking for a sport to cut. They cut wrestling, and to your point that with the advent of women's wrestling, it's become less. And again, I think that's just another thing. I think Title IX was a factor, but with the growth in women's wrestling, it stopped that from being the largest factor.
And what we have to do too is look at the word factor. Okay, let's not look at it from it's only because of this, because when you're looking now, Title IX's been on the books in 72, enforced really heavily starting in 79, 96. Really, we saw a lot of the way prong one became safe harbor. You can look at the history books, but we're talking 25 years ago. It's been on the books to the point now that if any athletic director creates a Title IX problem, that is their fault, and they cannot blame the law, which has been on the books for almost 50 years at this point. So to say, oh, it's Title IX now in this day and age right now, to me, it's a non-starter, because to say, oh, this is because of Title IX. Now, let's know that there is compliance and gender equity. It is involved in every single move. Can we add a women's sport? What's it look for our Title IX numbers? Can we add a men's sport? What's it look like for our Title IX numbers? That doesn't mean it's a factor. It means it plays a role. So when we're looking at sports to cut, sadly, places that didn't have women's wrestling were a little bit more vulnerable. And now, like we said, we've had 72 schools that have not made themselves vulnerable, because any sport can be cut at any given time, depending on how forward thinking or backwards thinking the administration is. But we've gotten away from the point that to blame. Well, Now what do we blame now? We hit our lowest point. Now we're moving up. So at what point do we just have to basically suck it up and be like, well, we kind of lost that argument as far as that being the lone point? There's still people that will always agree. And I know it's going to be a hard pill for people to swallow, to know that, well, and you also now you can't look at a 2021 situation through a 1975 lens. That's what we're trying to apply, because yes, we had fewer sports options and we had more teams, and we also had teams like Alabama, for example. Use them. They didn't have a team very long. It's not like these were ancient teams that were cut.
No.
It's not like you're cutting a Penn or a Columbia that started at the turn of the century. Okay, we started up in 69, we're done in 80. I mean, it really wasn't there that long, and some of these big Power 5 schools didn't even have any tradition to begin with. So are we really better off? I mean, it's devil's advocate playing here. So we look at some of these schools that we clamor for wrestling. If they don't want it, do they deserve it?
I agree, Jason. We get sometimes, and one of the things is, we were too quick to point fingers and not thumbs at ourselves for some of the stuff we didn't do to help it.
What's the saying? You point one at somebody, that how many are pointing back at you?
Yeah, the three are pointing back at you. Yeah. I always use the expression point thumbs, not fingers, at yourself. So it's the same thing. Yeah.
Okay, I got you.
Exactly.
It's a video show, in case you're wondering. If you're listening on the podcast, I was pointing at the camera and my thumb was pointing back at me. Just a little note there.
And thank you for that. And it is one of these things that we get caught up in, and I was a senior in high school when Bama dropped, and then of course I went to Tennessee the next year. So we get caught up on these big athletic schools, or Notre Dame that people love for whatever reason, Syracuse people love for whatever reason. But if they don't want to have wrestling, why bother with them? Let's try to help out the small schools that are adding, or the big schools that want to add. And this is a great stat that Jason's putting on the computer right now. There's been 448 men's teams that have dropped at some point. Some dates we don't know. I know Jason did most of this.
There's a lot of stuff too, and this is not counting closures. Okay, this is known drops.
This is drops.
Correct.
Only one school that dropped, not counting schools closing, that had a women's team drop the men's team. One of the 448. Okay, so any male who's now thinking women's wrestling is a risk to men's wrestling either is uneducated on this, and I'll point a thumb since I'm the stats guy here, I'm trying to get this out to them, or they just don't want to listen. Because this is women's teams do not drop as a rule.
We have schools close, obviously, and then we financial situations that or sometimes if you're dropping teams, it's en masse. It's not just the wrestling team. I think, because I think this number may be 2, because this is the first time I've seen a slide. I think Bacone was in a situation they dropped like 8 sports. And they were almost closing, and they actually did stay alive. Stanford did keep all theirs, thankfully.
Bacone was one that was about to close, but did not.
So that's one. But otherwise, and here's the point: you've got right there. Okay, Boomer at a women's team. Don't listen to me, folks. Okay, because I'm not. I'm the Gen X guy. I'm the guy that's behind you. That most of the time, I've got your grandkids. This is. Glenn, for lack of a better term, you're the boomer guy telling your fellow boomers, pay attention to this women's wrestling thing.
Correct. Pay attention. I've been screaming this for years, and Kevin Hazard's been screaming it with us. And it's a great thing. We have more female high school wrestlers than ever before. This is an amazing stat. There's now over 30,000 female high school wrestlers. That is more than there are NCAA Division I football players. Try and wrap your head around that for a minute. And of course, football is what it is. I'm going to the Tennessee-Georgia game this weekend. Okay, I'm glad I'm going. Okay.
I love college football, even though it was probably a culprit in where my alma mater dropped the sport.
Very well could have been, in Old Dominion.
But I still love college football. I don't like that college football team, but I love college football.
Yeah. And so it's just a staggering thought for people that they want to say girls wrestling is so small. Well, put it in that perspective. There are more high school female wrestlers right now than there are NCAA Division I football players.
Well, and another point on this, and I wish we had the statistic in the growth of high school wrestling for for the girls, because I know it just, and it's almost the same kind of growth we're seeing at the college level. The number of states that are now doing championships for girls, it's getting big enough in each state that there's now a separate girls championship. I mean, Texas, California, of course, were among the first, but you guys, I'm not good with a statistic on that, but I've been watching and it just, again, it's just going to get bigger and bigger, and I think in 10 years we'll have it in as many states as we have high school boys.
I want to touch on this, you from the experience of a high school coach. When you have a girl come into your wrestling room back in the day, it was usually her or maybe one other. Usually it's just one girl per team. Was kind of like, okay, the girl wrestler. It was the anomaly. It was, it was the, I don't want to call it a sideshow, but for example, when those young women got attention, it was usually for the wrong reasons. Be like, oh, look at the girl out there, and it became a situation where people would frame it as it was a no-win situation for the boy. Now we're seeing that with girls teams, girls are more inclined to come out for a wrestling program when they don't have to wrestle the boys. If they're going to wrestle each other, they show up in droves. So, to borrow the Field of Dreams, if you build it, they will come. Give them the opportunity to wrestle themselves. They're more likely to do it versus, okay, I'm going to go up and get beat up by a bunch of dudes. So that's not really an enticing invitation to try wrestling. It's like, okay, here's our boys that are just going to, that are more seasoned, that are, any first year wrestler is going to come in and take their lumps. So, getting past that, it's more inviting now when you have girls and girls competing with one another, and because they are different sports, they're different. There's different techniques that go involved. And I'm not talking about the folk style freestyle thing, but just the physicality of the sport. They are very different. You can't necessarily train a women's wrestler the same way you can a male wrestler. So we're seeing that. And from your experiences, Kevin, where have you seen maybe the differences when you had that girl walk into your wrestling room for the first time versus their opportunities now?
Well, the biggest thing I remember, again, I coached the kids, high school and college. The girls that came in, a lot of times, if they were young or they were coming in with their brother, but the ones that stuck it out and the one that got to high school and they were still doing it were physically, but even more so mentally tough. I mean, they take a licking, they get up, and those are the ones you love. I mean, I've always found girls to be more coachable. They learn better, and if they have some physical prowess, they're going to beat a boy. I mean, I watched this year or last year one of Brian's kids. I mean, he's got to wrestle a girl, and he's not favored because this girl who's now at Army. I mean, she's the captain of her team. She's a 3-time district place winner, and she's been to states twice. So they're tough, and I think they're going to lose a little bit of that, not having to wrestle the boys. But to your point, they're going to be. It's going to make the sport bigger because now they'll have their own pool to wrestle.
So thank you for that, Kevin. Jason just put up on the screen here for anybody who's watching, or if you're listening, I'll try to relay it to you. Both men and women's wrestling has the lowest percentage of high school to NCAA participation percentage in 2019. That shows us there is plenty of room for growth on the college level. Okay, we can easily have more men and women's teams. People have been asking me, and others, of course, are we growing women too quickly? Well, if you look at the average number here, and if you go to the next slide, Jason, you can see then that we can add, if we just have the same percentage of high school girls go on from high school to college as all the other sports have, we could, okay, if we had a 25-woman roster, we could have 70 NCAA teams. With a 20-woman roster, 88. That's just NCAA teams. That's not counting the NAIA and the JUCOs. Okay, so right now we are underrepresented. Right now with these numbers, we should have at least 53, okay, women's teams. I mean, we have 53 women's teams right now. NCAA, we should have more than that. There is room for growth in this sport.
And think about the dynamic of what I was saying earlier about 8 years from now when we have more high schools states sanctioning, and then those numbers
Yes.
will grow.
Yeah.
Every single high school state with women's wrestling, girls wrestling, has grown in its participation. That is proven. You can look that up. COVID year might be the abnormality. So you take the COVID situation out, you're still looking at growth. I mean, just talk about what we've seen in New Jersey. With what Chris Ayers, his daughter, Chloe,
Chloe's amazing.
and you sit there and what his wife has done with this, and it's just like, what? It's just they showed up in just teams, just in Pennsylvania's finally starting to catch that bowl. I think we're almost at 30 with the number of teams. We just had another one.
Jason, I was helping out the Princeton area, and I got the fortune to watch Chloe Ayers when she was a young girl wrestling. And boy, oh boy, is that girl? She loves the sport. She's skilled. Hats off to her, man.
But again, we're going to have this number's only that first column here, 1770. That's only going to go up. So we're going to see that.
Yeah,
now,
no question.
Here's the one thing that we love to talk about being a multi-sport athlete, being something that is like, okay, if you're not a wrestler first, which pretty much, if you're of a certain size, chances are, and you're a good athlete, you're going to probably be playing another sport, because small schools especially rely on multi-sport athletes. I know in high school, our top 2,000-yard rushers were a 135-pounder and a 145-pounder. They weren't a bruising 250-pound fullback, We look at where football benefits from wrestlers. We look at cross country gaining wrestlers because they're getting in shape for wrestling. It works both ways. You got the wrestler that's playing another sport to get better at wrestling, and then you've got the athlete playing another sport that's wrestling to get better at another sport too. We've got a lot of football references too, because if you're a football coach and you're not encouraging your linemen, anybody that's even skill positions, Roddy White, all-pro wide receiver, multiple time state champ in South Carolina. So there's a place for every football player in that wrestling room.
Yeah, one thing I always, like I said before, one family, one team, one sport. First of all, it's the right thing to have women's wrestling and to give them the opportunity. But if there are some boomers of me and Kevin's generation who don't understand this is the way I try to explain it to them. In the last 25 NFL drafts, okay, the number one overall pick has been a quarterback, a left tackle, or an edge rusher. In other words, the guy that throws a touchdown, the guy that protects them, or the guy that kills them, okay? Because they understand how important it is. And we've all heard of the famous movie, The Blind Side, to protect the left tackle, to protect the quarterback, okay? Now, of course, the last team not to draft one of these three positions was the New York Jets, which shows they have no knowledge of what this whole draft is about.
The Jets have never known what a draft strategy is.
Ever since Joe Namath left, the Jets have been a disaster. Okay, but anyway, what we now see, boomers, is women's wrestling not only is great to watch and adds to it and is the right thing to do, and we want to see it. We want to see Chloe Ayers get her chance where she wants to go to school. It also is protecting our blind side. We've learned in this show that men's wrestling is growing now with the advent of women. The teams with women don't drop men's teams by and large. This is a great thing. So even if for whatever reason you're behind the times, think about this. You're doing the right thing and you're keeping a men's team.
Things that Wrestle Like a Girl, the NWCA and USA Wrestling are doing, the National Wrestling Hall of Fame. There's all these players are involved and working together. And it's what's interesting is, we've got people that used to be sitting across the table from one another, pointing the finger at one another, working together now to grow wrestling. And, that's for some people that you look at like, what's going on? Wait, what? Is this real life? Yes, it's real life, because we see, and Terry Steiner famously said, wrestling provides so many opportunities for men. We get so much out of it. Why would we keep that to only half the population? So, you've got a lot of people that have changed their minds over the years, and you go to the World Championships and you see just the technical acumen that the Japanese have, and while we're chasing, we're Americans. We believe we're the best wrestling country in the world, and we'll point the finger at the Russians for doing this and doing that. You can't really point to the Japanese and say they're doing things nefariously or questionably. They are just they got behind women's wrestling early,
technique,
and they've been running with it, and we've been catching up ever since. And this type of situation is going to help. If you get the power of the United States population behind a sport, it's only a matter of time. So we get all these colleges and high schools. We're going to have thousands and thousands of more girls that fall in love with this sport and become great women's wrestlers that populate our Olympic ladder. And some of them may not even want to go on beyond college. They have different dreams and desires. Some of them might want to be coaches and teachers. And then you've got the ones that want to work in business. I mean, men and women, boys and girls have different interests. We know that. So, but we all can have the same shared interest in wrestling, no matter which background, gender. It's like you said, wrestling's for everybody, size, shape, color, creed, gender, whatever. It's all there for all of us.
I think to go along with that, you brought up the fact that the world championships, and we had the women had 7 place winners, bronze to gold, and I think that's going to be a factor in drawing. And we got great publicity, between the Olympics and the world championships this year. Great television publicity, and on the men and women's side. That's gonna add to the explosive growth in high school and college wrestling.
Glenn, before we close, any final thoughts? Because we're going to come back to the women's wrestling discussion in the future. We're going to bring on Sally Roberts. We're going to bring on Andrew Yamamoto. We're going to bring all the players involved in women's wrestling rather than have 3 white guys sitting here telling you about how great women's wrestling is.
Exactly.
We're going to get a perspective. This is just a wet your whistle and to tell you that there is movement here. And if you're not paying attention to it, you better, because this is not a gimmick. This is here to stay. Every girl that's born now that wants to fall in love with the sport of wrestling is going to grow up in a world where they don't know women's wrestling never existed. And that to me, like now, Fargo, we're looking at the kids wrestling now. They're born after 2002, which is making me go, wait, I'm getting old now. The hairline notwithstanding. So all these girls that are not going to know that Fargo for them never existed. Every girl's going to have this opportunity, just like every boy does. And I think that's a great thing about how great our sport of wrestling is.
Yeah, and just what we talked about on the pilot episode here is, we have 3 main topics, technique, growth, and women's wrestling. And we're going to hit on different ones at different times. And sometimes some huge announcement like Iowa adding women's wrestling will do what our next topic is. So, and we're just going to try to do whatever we can do on this to keep the show rolling. One show might be about wrestlers in business, the WIBN network that we're all trying to get off the ground. So, we're just going to have different topics each month. We have a monthly show. It's great to have Jason Bryant as part of this now, because he really knows he's a consummate professional at this. So thank you for joining us, Jason.
And one thing for those that are wondering, this is part of the State of Wrestling parent podcast of the NWCA. So this is where you'll hear the Wrestlers in Business Network speaker series, the MatStats show, and of course the traditional updates where we talk to Mike, Pat, Nate, and the crew at the NWCA, talking about conventions and things of that nature too, all of our other topics. So this is pretty much a catch-all for our NWCA video and audio content. So that's what we got. Kevin Hazard, I'm going to give you the final word because you know what? I know that the Hazard name invokes words and speaking and goofiness. So I'm gonna let you close this out because Glenn did the heavy lifting. I'm gonna let you get the comic relief. No, I'm just kidding. I'm gonna let you close us out today.
Okay, I want to. My final thought is congratulations to Mike Moyer for being inducted into the National Wrestling Hall of Fame.
Hats off, Mike.
Because of his real hard work. I think a lot of what we're talking about is due to his leadership in the wrestling community.
No question.
Yeah. And that's a topic that we're going to have Mike on to talk about because as to not extend the show any longer, I just know that I worked in that office with Mike and Pat and the crew for 3 years, and not a day went by where he wasn't on the phone with some school president, administrator, athletic director talking about adding wrestling. And the big schools too. He wasn't just looking at the enrollment driven one. He was talking to Power 5 people. He never stops wanting to add wrestling programs. And so Mike's getting the Order of Merit from the National Wrestling Hall of Fame this coming summer. So a great honor. And I just want people to know he is a tireless worker when it comes to picking up the phone, writing letters, getting the local community involved, getting the politicians involved, getting people that can make a difference in those communities involved. So part of that too is tied in the Wrestlers in Business Network, strengthening that and keeping our programs alive that way too, with the showcasing that, hey, wrestlers are business owners. They can help your program and help your school. It's not just like add wrestling and we're done. Greg Hatcher has shown that we can, what's your science department need? Does your soccer team need anything? So Mike has been, greasing the wheels around the world for the sport of wrestling for over 25 years. So yes, Kevin,
Uh,
great point in bringing up Mike's induction. And with that, we'll wrap up episode 3 of
Yeah.
the MatStats show. For Glenn Gormley and Kevin Hazard, I'm Jason Bryant. We will talk stats and goofy nerdiness next time.